I want you to think about how many small, repeated routines exist around keeping a child safe. Routines so ordinary, so built into the rhythm of an average week that you stop consciously registering them as safety measures at all. The school pickup line is one of those routines for most parents. You show up, you wait in the same general spot, you watch for the same small face among a crowd of other small faces, and within a few minutes, your child is buckled into the back seat and the entire process resets itself for the next afternoon. I want to tell you about the 3 weeks I spent slowly realizing that one of the adults standing in that pickup line with me, week after week, was not there for the reason every other parent standing beside him was. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I am a 34-year-old mother, and I have a daughter, Maya, who was 7 years old at the time this happened, in the 2nd grade at an elementary school outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I picked her up most afternoons myself, the same routine I'd followed since she started kindergarten, arriving a few minutes before the bell, parking in roughly the same spot along the curb, standing with a small, familiar cluster of other regular parents while we waited for the doors to open and the flood of small backpacks and lunchboxes to spill out onto the sidewalk. This is the story of the man who started appearing in that pickup line, and the 3 weeks it took me to understand exactly why something about his presence there felt wrong long before I had any concrete reason to say it out loud. I want to say clearly, before I go any further, that I am telling this story because it ended the way every parent hopes a story like this ends, with my daughter safe, with the situation resolved through police involvement rather than through any tragedy. I am telling it because I believe the small, easily dismissed details that eventually led to that resolution are worth understanding, not because anything happened to Maya directly, but because of how close a series of small, procedural failures came to allowing something considerably worse. I want you to picture that pickup line the way I still can, with a clarity that surprises me, given how ordinary it felt for years before any of this happened. The specific late afternoon light in October, slanting low and gold across the school's front lawn. The particular sound of 100 small conversations happening at once the moment those doors finally opened. Backpacks unzipping, sneakers scuffing pavement, the high, bright pitch of children's voices calling out to parents and to each other in the specific, unguarded way children have of announcing themselves to the world without a second thought. I had stood in that exact spot, at that exact hour, more afternoons than I could count by that point in the school year, and it had never once occurred to me to think of it as anything other than the single safest, most predictable part of my entire day. That is, I think, precisely what makes a place like a school pickup line so difficult to watch carefully. It is designed in every visible way to feel safe, supervised by staff, populated by familiar faces, bounded by rules and routines that suggest, without ever needing to say so directly, that nothing genuinely dangerous could possibly unfold in full view of so many watchful parents. I trusted that feeling completely, the way I imagine every parent standing beside me trusted it too, right up until the specific week I began to understand that trust and actual safety are not always the same thing. I first noticed him on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in October, standing near the edge of the pickup area, close enough to the flow of exiting children to be part of the crowd, but not quite positioned the way the rest of us regulars had unconsciously arranged ourselves over the school year. I want to describe the specific social geography of that pickup line because I think it matters for understanding what felt off about him from the very beginning. Regular pickup parents, over enough weeks, tend to sort themselves into a loose, unspoken pattern. The same general clusters, the same rough distance from the doors, small nods and brief conversations exchanged with the same familiar faces day after day. It is not a formal arrangement. No one assigns you a spot,
But it develops anyway, the way any repeated human gathering eventually develops its own quiet choreography. He did not fit into that choreography. He stood slightly apart from every cluster, not quite close enough to any group to seem like he belonged to it, his attention fixed on the doors with an intensity that felt different from the distracted, phone-scrolling half-attention most of us gave the same doors while we waited. I remember noticing that first day simply that he was new, a reasonable enough observation, since new parents and grandparents and occasional aunts and uncles rotate through pickup duty constantly, and nothing about a single unfamiliar face registered as anything beyond mildly noteworthy. I saw him again the following Monday in almost the exact same position, and again on Wednesday, and by the following week I had begun to register in the same slow, accumulating way I imagine most parents eventually notice patterns in a routine this repetitive, that he was becoming one of the regular fixtures of that pickup line, without ever actually becoming familiar the way the rest of us regulars had grown familiar with each other. I want to describe what familiar actually meant in the specific, small-scale social ecosystem of that pickup line, because I think the contrast matters. Over a school year, you learn things about the other regular parents without ever formally exchanging much information at all. Whose child is in which class, who tends to arrive early, and who's reliably rushing in at the last possible minute. Small, accumulated fragments of a shared routine that gradually turn strangers into something closer to familiar acquaintances. I knew, by October, which grandmother picked up the twins in 4B, which father coached the same soccer team half our kids played on, which nanny always brought a small dog on a leash that the kids swarmed the moment she appeared. These were not close relationships. They were the specific, low-stakes familiarity that comes from simply occupying the same small patch of sidewalk at the same hour, week after week. He never became part of that familiarity, no matter how many weeks he appeared. He did not make small talk. He did not exchange the small reflexive nods regular parents extend to each other by pure force of habit. He stood at the edges, present but unintegrated, in a way that I did not consciously register as strange until I had enough additional weeks of data to actually notice the absence of something the rest of us had built without ever trying to.
What eventually moved him from mildly noteworthy to something I could not stop thinking about was a small, specific detail I overheard entirely by accident, standing close enough to him one afternoon that his brief exchange with another parent carried clearly across the few feet between us. A teacher's aide, walking a line of first graders toward the pickup area, called out a child's name, checking a clipboard against the small crowd of waiting adults. The man stepped forward, said a name, a different child's name, not the one the aide had called, and gestured vaguely toward the group of exiting children, as though gathering the wrong child was simply an understandable mix-up, rather than something that should have registered as concerning to anyone standing nearby. The aide, to her credit, caught the discrepancy immediately, checked her clipboard again, and redirected him, politely but firmly, explaining that the child he'd named wasn't actually part of that dismissal group at all. He apologized, said something about grandchildren and always mixing up which day he had which one, and stepped back into the crowd without further incident. I want to be honest that in the moment I did not think much of it beyond a passing mild curiosity. Grandparents genuinely do mix up pickup schedules, especially with multiple grandchildren across different grades and different days. It was a plausible explanation, offered smoothly, accepted without further scrutiny by the one staff member positioned to actually catch such things. But I noticed over the following days that this was not an isolated mix-up. I watched him make a similar error twice more over the next 2 weeks, approaching briefly toward one child's dismissal group before redirecting,
offering some version of the same vague, apologetic explanation each time. Always different children, always a different small mismatch between the name he seemed to expect and the actual dismissal roster the staff were working from. I mentioned it once to my husband over dinner, describing it the way you describe something you're not yet sure is worth mentioning at all. Half a story, hedged with qualifiers, probably nothing, but... He listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and ultimately shrugged it off much the way I had initially, suggesting, reasonably, that elderly relatives really do struggle with multiple grandchildren's schedules sometimes. I remember agreeing with him out loud, while some quieter part of me continued turning the pattern over anyway, unconvinced by my own reasonable explanation, even as I offered it. I began paying closer attention after the third mix-up, in a way I felt slightly uncomfortable about even as I was doing it, watching him more carefully than I watched almost anyone else in that pickup line, noting which specific groups of children drew his attention, noting that his mistakes, if that's genuinely what they were, never seemed to repeat toward the same child twice. I mentioned what I'd noticed to another regular parent I'd become close with over the school year, a woman named Priya, whose son was in Maya's class. She had noticed him too, independently, and had assumed, much the way I initially had, that he was simply an unusually forgetful relative of some student neither of us knew personally. But laid out together are two separate observations, my 3 witnessed mix-ups, her own recollection of at least 2 additional incidents involving different children entirely, began to form a pattern that felt considerably less explainable than isolated grandparental confusion. I want to describe the specific discomfort of watching a stranger closely enough to notice this kind of pattern, because it does not feel like the confident, decisive vigilance you might imagine from the outside. It felt instead like a slow, uncertain accumulation of doubt, constantly second-guessed, constantly weighed against the very real possibility that I was building an elaborate, unfair suspicion around a genuinely confused elderly man who simply had too many grandchildren and not enough organizational skill to keep them straight. I began quietly, discreetly, taking note of the specific dates and children involved each time I witnessed one of his apparent mix-ups, along with a few photographs taken at a distance, telling myself I was probably overreacting and doing it anyway, because some deeper instinct told me that if I was wrong, the cost of documentation was nothing, and if I was right, the cost of not documenting it might be considerably higher than I wanted to seriously consider. I want to be honest about how strange that felt, practically speaking, standing in a pickup line I had occupied without a second thought for nearly 2 full school years, suddenly holding my phone at an angle designed to look like idle scrolling, while actually documenting a stranger's movements and approximate location relative to specific children. I felt more than once during those weeks a genuine flush of embarrassment at my own behavior, imagining how it would sound explained out loud to someone skeptical. A mother secretly photographing a confused old man because he occasionally got names wrong. I nearly stopped several times. I kept going anyway, driven by something that felt less like confidence and more like a stubborn, low-grade refusal to simply let the unease go unexamined. Priya and I began comparing notes quietly, texting each other small updates after pickup on the days one of us noticed something, a name, a rough time, a brief description of which group of children had drawn his attention that particular afternoon. Neither of us framed it at the time as building a case. We framed it to each other and to ourselves as simply being thorough, being careful, the kind of mild, private vigilance we told ourselves any reasonably attentive parent might practice without it meaning anything definitive at all.
The moment that finally moved me from careful documentation to immediate action happened on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after I'd first noticed him standing at the edge of that pickup line. I was slightly further back in the crowd than usual that day, having arrived a few minutes later than my normal routine, and from that distance I watched him step subtly closer to a small cluster of exiting kindergartners than I ever seen him position himself before, crouching slightly to bring himself to a child's eye level, saying something I could not hear from where I stood, while the teacher's aide responsible for that dismissal group was momentarily turned away, distracted by an unrelated question from another parent. I did not wait to see what happened next. I moved through the crowd as quickly as I could without breaking into an outright run, calling out to the aide by name, gesturing toward what I was seeing, my voice carrying a specific urgency I had never once needed to use in that pickup line before. The aide turned immediately, closing the distance to that child and the man within seconds, her own trained instincts apparently recognizing the moment she registered what was happening, exactly the kind of situation her training had prepared her to intervene in. The man straightened up quickly, said something I still could not hear, and began walking, with deliberate, unhurried steps, away from the pickup area entirely, toward the parking lot beyond. I did not let him simply walk away. I followed at a careful distance, phone already in hand, capturing his direction of travel, the general description of his vehicle once he reached it, and critically, his license plate before he pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the street. I want to describe what those final seconds felt like because they are unlike anything else I have experienced as a parent. Everything narrowed in that moment to a kind of hyper-focused clarity. The specific color and make of his car, the exact sequence of numbers and letters on that plate, repeated silently to myself over and over until I could get it typed into my phone with hands that were shaking considerably more than I registered at the time. I did not think about whether I was overreacting anymore. Every trace of that earlier familiar self-doubt had simply evaporated, replaced by a single absolute clarity that whatever I had just witnessed required immediate, decisive action rather than one more round of reasonable, generous explanation. Maya, I should say, had not yet been dismissed at that point. Her own classroom's exit came several minutes later than the kindergarten group, a small, arbitrary scheduling detail that meant she had no direct proximity to what unfolded, and no awareness, then or since, that any of it happened at all. I want to be honest that part of what drove me so completely in that moment was not yet knowing that fact for certain, watching her classroom's doors still closed, doing rapid, panicked math about how close his position had actually been to the eventual spot where my own daughter would soon be standing, unaccompanied, for the handful of seconds it takes any child to cross from a school doorway to a waiting parent's arms.
The school's response, once I brought everything I had documented to the front office that same afternoon, was immediate and considerably more thorough than I had braced myself for. The principal and the school's resource officer, a former police officer now working full-time in a school safety role, pulled me into a private meeting within minutes, along with the aide who had witnessed the final incident directly. I laid out everything I had, the dates, the pattern of near misses with different children, the photographs, the license plate I'd captured as he left. The resource officer's expression shifted over the course of that conversation from professional attentiveness into something considerably more serious, and he excused himself partway through to make a call I understood from the tone of it was not a routine one. Local police arrived at the school within the hour,
and I gave a full statement, along with Priya, who was contacted separately once the school confirmed her name from my own account. The license plate, once run through official channels, matched a vehicle registered to a man with a documented history that the officer taking my statement would not fully detail to me directly, beyond confirming, carefully, that the pattern I had described was consistent with behavior they took extremely seriously, and that my documentation, however uncertain I had felt gathering it, had given them considerably more to work with than a single isolated report would have. The school implemented, within days, a stricter identification verification process for pickup, a formal check against an approved list of authorized adults for every single child, with photo identification required for anyone not already recognized by staff, closing exactly the kind of ambiguous, incremental gap that had allowed him to approach children directly for 3 full weeks without any single mistake ever being severe enough on its own to trigger a decisive intervention. I remember sitting in that administrative office, watching the principal's expression shift through the same progression mine had over the previous 3 weeks, polite attentiveness giving way, gradually, to genuine alarm as the individual incidents I described began assembling themselves out loud into a pattern she had clearly not registered as connected until I laid them out in sequence. She apologized to me directly, more than once, for a gap in the school's system that had allowed exactly this kind of ambiguous, incremental approach to go unaddressed for so long. An apology I did not entirely want in the moment, but understood later as a genuinely important acknowledgement that the failure hadn't been mine, hadn't been Priya's, hadn't even entirely been the aides who'd been distracted at exactly the wrong moment. It had been a systemic gap that any sufficiently patient, sufficiently deliberate person could have exploited, and very nearly had. The resource officer, before police arrived, asked me a series of careful, specific questions that I understood, even in the moment, were designed to help him assess how urgently to escalate what I was describing. How close had he gotten physically to my daughter specifically, or to any specific child? Had he ever touched a child directly? Had he ever attempted to remove a child from the pickup area entirely? I answered honestly that, as far as I had personally witnessed, he had not crossed that final, most severe threshold, but that the pattern of near misses, growing steadily bolder over 3 weeks, felt to me like a trajectory rather than a static set of isolated incidents. The investigation that followed over the subsequent weeks confirmed that the man had a documented history involving prior concerns at 2 other schools in neighboring districts, incidents that had been reported at the time but had never individually met the threshold required for formal charges. Each isolated incident dismissed, much the way ours nearly had been, as confusion, coincidence, or an honest mistake, until the accumulated pattern across multiple locations became impossible to explain away entirely. Detective Alvarez, who handled the case going forward, explained to me during a follow-up conversation that this specific pattern, testing boundaries repeatedly across different children, different schools, different pickup lines, each individual incident calibrated to remain just ambiguous enough to avoid immediate decisive consequences, was a recognized behavioral pattern her department had been trained to watch for, precisely because it was designed to exploit exactly the kind of reasonable doubt every individual witness naturally extends to what looks, on its own, like an innocent mistake. She told me, in terms I found both validating and deeply unsettling, that my own uncertain, self-doubting documentation over those 3 weeks had likely been the single most useful piece of evidence in the entire case, not because any individual photograph or date proved anything decisive on its own, but because the cumulative pattern, assembled carefully over time by someone who had apparently learned across multiple locations and multiple attempts exactly how much ambiguity a situation could sustain before triggering real consequences, and had built an entire pattern of behavior around staying just beneath that threshold again and again across different schools, different children, different unsuspecting staff members, each extending the same reasonable benefit of the doubt that I very nearly extended to. She told me that the other schools involved in the pattern had each individually dismissed their own incidents in almost exactly the way ours nearly had: a confused grandfather, an honest mix-up, nothing worth escalating on its own. It was only the accumulation across multiple locations, cross-referenced once our own report finally connected his license plate to an existing file, that revealed the actual sustained pattern underneath what had looked, at every individual location, like nothing more than an isolated, forgivable oddity. I asked her directly whether documenting what I'd seen had actually made a meaningful difference, or whether the broader investigation would have eventually caught up to him regardless. She was honest with me in a way I've thought about often since. She said she genuinely didn't know, and that the honest answer to questions like that almost never comes with certainty, but that every additional data point mattered. Every additional location and pattern and photograph narrowed the specific, uncertain window during which someone like that could continue operating undetected, and that narrowing that window, even by a few weeks, even without ever being able to prove definitively how many additional incidents it prevented, was never nothing.
Maya is safe. I want to say that plainly, because I know how frightening a story like this can feel to sit with, and I want the fear it produces to be useful rather than simply corrosive. She never knew, at the time, that any of this was happening around her, and she still does not know the full details even now, years later, a decision her father and I made deliberately, choosing to protect her from a fear she did not need to carry at 7 years old, while still, quietly, becoming considerably more vigilant parents than we had been before. What stays with me most, more than the fear itself, is how genuinely uncertain I felt for almost the entire 3 weeks I spent noticing him, how many times I nearly talked myself out of taking it seriously, how reasonable every single individual explanation had sounded on its own. That is, I have come to believe, precisely the design of behavior like his, not overt, obvious danger that any reasonable person would immediately recognize and report, but a slow accumulation of small, individually forgivable mistakes, calibrated specifically to exploit the reasonable doubt that decent, fair-minded people naturally extend to strangers who haven't yet done anything definitively wrong. If you are a parent who does school pickup regularly, I want you to take one specific thing from what happened to us. Trust the accumulating pattern over the individual explanation. A single mix-up is almost certainly nothing. A repeated pattern of mix-ups across different children over multiple weeks deserves documentation and a direct report to school staff, even before you feel fully certain something is genuinely wrong. Ask your school directly about their pickup verification process and push for something more rigorous than simple staff recognition if that's currently all that exists. And trust your own quiet, uncertain unease enough to document it even when you cannot yet fully justify it to yourself. I very nearly did not. I am deeply grateful every single day since that I did. I still stand in that same pickup line most afternoons, though it looks different now. A check-in table near the entrance, a staff member with a clipboard verifying identification against an approved list before any adult I don't already know is permitted anywhere near the dismissal groups.
It takes a few extra minutes some days. I have never once heard another parent complain about that delay, not once in all the months since the change was implemented, and I understand exactly why. A few extra minutes feels like nothing at all, measured against what those minutes are actually protecting. I think about those 3 weeks often still, in a way I suspect I will continue thinking about them for years. Not with the sharp, immediate fear I felt in that final moment watching him crouch down near a group of kindergartners, but with a quieter, more enduring gratitude for Priya for noticing alongside me and validating what I might otherwise have talked myself out of in the moment, for the aide who turned the instant I called her name, for whatever stubborn, uncertain instinct kept me documenting something I could never quite fully justify to myself in the moment. If there is one thing I want every parent watching this to carry away, it is simply this: you do not need certainty to act. You need only the willingness to take your own quiet unease seriously enough to write it down, to mention it to someone else, to bring it to the people whose job it is to evaluate it properly. The pattern that finally exposed him was built entirely out of small, individually dismissible observations that only became undeniable once someone was willing to keep noticing, even while unsure, even while doubting herself the entire way through.